The night was meant to be a celebration of shadows, a night when masks hid the truth and darkness became a costume that every street wore with pride. But long before the first carved pumpkins glowed, there was already something unnatural in the air, a silence too heavy for October. It lingered on porches, clung to window glass, and seemed to hum low in the throats of stray dogs that refused to wander past the town's edges. The silence was not simply the absence of noise. It was the sound of something waiting. On Halloween night, people laugh louder than usual. They knock on strangers' doors with no fear, and they welcome shadows on their porches. But what happens when the shadows do not leave? What happens when the knocking never ends? Some say Halloween was never invented for children. It was born out of fear, rituals to keep the dead away, distractions for the hungry things that walked between the living. And yet, century by century, people forgot why the masks mattered. In that forgotten town, the night began as every Halloween had before. Costumes brushed against one another on crowded sidewalks, plastic fangs gleamed under porch lights, and laughter burst in waves down the rows of houses. But those who remember it clearly, those who survived, speak of something colder beneath the laughter. They describe an unease that lived in their stomachs long before the first scream tore through the streets. A boy swore he saw a figure standing at the edge of the cornfield, long before sunset, staring at the town without moving. His mother told him it was only a scarecrow, though there had never been one in that field. An old man swore he heard footsteps on his porch, though no one knocked, and when he opened the door, a single candy bucket sat waiting, already full. A young woman walking home from work whispered that the air itself felt wrong, like the day was ending too fast, as if darkness wanted more than just the hours after sundown. Most ignored the signs. After all, it was Halloween, a night built on tricks and illusions. No one wanted to believe the wrongness could be real. Until midnight came, and the tricks did not end. A group of children claimed that one of their friends had vanished during a game of hide-and-seek between the houses. They thought she had been playing a cruel prank, hiding longer than she should have. But when they searched, they found her costume in pieces scattered along the street as if she had outgrown it in an instant, or been forced out of it. She never returned. Her name was whispered that night like a curse, but by morning, no record of her seemed to exist. It was as if she had been erased, not just taken. Neighbors whispered of screams they thought were part of the festivities. They said the sound of terror was woven so tightly into the laughter that no one could tell the difference. They spoke of masks that looked too real, costumes that moved in ways fabric never could. Some described people they did not recognize in the crowds, faces too pale, eyes too dark, smiles too wide. And when the police came later, no record of these strangers could be found. No one admitted to inviting them. No one claimed to know them. They arrived with the night and they vanished with it. By dawn, the town was changed forever. Families locked their doors and refused to speak of what had happened. Parents who once handed out candy now drew curtains tight, praying the knocking would not return. The streets, once glowing with carved lanterns, turned into hollow paths where even daylight felt gray. And every year after, on the last day of October, the silence came back, heavier, colder, more patient. What happened that night was not written in newspapers. It was whispered in kitchens, cried out in sleepless dreams, and buried beneath years of denial. But memory is harder to silence than fear, and the question still lingers, carried like smoke through every Halloween night that followed. If the masks are meant to protect us, what happens when they no longer work? The town was small enough to vanish on a map, but it carried a history that was impossible to bury. Long before the houses stood in their neat rows and the streets filled with laughter on Halloween nights, the land was marked by something older. The earliest settlers spoke of the soil as if it were alive, a restless ground that did not welcome strangers. They told stories of crops that sprouted tall and healthy one season only to wither black the next, as if some unseen hand decided what could thrive and what must die. They warned their children never to wander alone at dusk, for shadows did not behave the same way there. When churches were built, they never stood for long. Wooden beams rotted too quickly, bells cracked before they could ring, and every congregation eventually fled. Yet the people who stayed claimed that the land did not like to be blessed, that it thrived on silence more than prayer. By the time the town grew into what it became, its people carried these stories like bloodlines. They laughed at them in daylight, but they locked their doors early once autumn returned. Halloween became something different here. Elsewhere, it was a holiday of games, costumes, and candy. In this town, it was a night that seemed too easy for the old stories to slip back into. Parents urged children not to stray too far, not to trust every face behind a mask, not to follow voices that called from dark corners. They never explained why. Perhaps because they could not. Perhaps because they knew explanations only made the fear stronger. There was one story that everyone knew, but no one admitted aloud. A century ago, when the town was still young, a family disappeared on Halloween night. Their house was found abandoned, food left on the table as if dinner had been interrupted. Lanterns still burned in the windows, but every door was wide open, swinging gently as if something had passed through without stopping. No bodies were ever found. No footprints marked the ground. It was as if the earth itself had taken them. For decades, families avoided that street. When new people moved in, they were never told the truth. But children always seemed to know, even if no one taught them. They avoided the house instinctively, crossing to the other side of the road without a word. Time moved forward. The town dressed itself in normalcy, building schools, stores, and neighborhoods. Outsiders never suspected anything strange, but those who grew up there felt it in their bones. They lived with an unspoken agreement. As long as they kept the stories quiet, maybe they would remain only stories. And so they kept their heads down. They celebrated Halloween like everyone else. Pumpkins on porches, parades in the square, candy passed from hand to hand. But underneath the surface, there was always a sense of bargaining. As if by honoring the holiday, they could keep something else satisfied. Some families carried older traditions. They carved pumpkins but never blew out the candles inside, letting them burn until they died naturally. As if extinguishing them early would invite something in. Others left bowls of food outside, not for children, but for whatever might pass through. They never spoke of these offerings. To mention them aloud would have been an admission that they feared something was real. But the rituals continued in silence, passed from parents to children in glances and gestures rather than words. The younger generation grew restless. To them, Halloween was meant to be fun, not survival. They laughed at the warnings, dismissed the strange rules, and dared one another to break them. They wore costumes that mocked death, masks that grinned too wide, and they roamed the streets without caution. They thought the fear belonged to the past. They thought nothing could touch them. But they were wrong. The older residents remembered how the air shifted in late October, how the days shortened not only because of the season, but because the light seemed to vanish faster here, how the trees leaned closer to the roads, their branches arching like fingers, how the wind sometimes carried voices that were not human. They noticed these things even if they pretended not to. They carried them like invisible weights, pressing down harder each year. It was in this atmosphere that the night began, the night no one could forget, no matter how much they tried. The night when laughter and fear became indistinguishable. The town had always balanced on a thin line between tradition and nightmare, but that year the line was crossed. No one knew why. Perhaps the offerings were ignored. Perhaps too many warnings were broken. Or perhaps the silence they had depended on for generations had finally ended. When the sun dipped behind the trees that evening, an unease settled over the houses. Curtains shifted as eyes peered into the streets. The carved pumpkins seemed to flicker with nervous light, their smiles unsteady. Dogs refused to bark as if they sensed that noise itself was dangerous. The older ones knew what it meant, but they said nothing. Words would not have saved them. Words had never saved anyone, and so the stage was set. A town with a history it buried but never escaped. A night where the veil between stories and reality was thinner than anyone wanted to believe, and a silence waiting patiently for its return. The people who stepped out onto those streets that Halloween thought they were safe behind their masks. They thought the night belonged to them, but by dawn the town would never look at Halloween the same way again. The evening began with color and sound. Children spilled into the streets dressed as monsters and ghosts, their voices sharp against the cool air as they ran from door to door. Porch lights glowed like stars scattered low to the ground, each one a beacon promising candy and warmth. For a few hours it seemed like any other Halloween. Parents laughed quietly from sidewalks, their hands clutching thermoses, their eyes following costumed shadows darting between houses. The air smelled of smoke and sweet caramel. Music drifted from open windows. On the surface, everything appeared normal. But underneath the laughter, something else moved. It was subtle at first. A missing decoration here, a darkened porch there. One house that had been covered in orange lights only hours before now stood in complete darkness, its carved pumpkins gone from the steps as if they had never been placed there. Some children stopped in front of it, confused, then moved on, too eager to notice the strange absence. But a few older residents whispered among themselves, uneasy, for they knew the family who lived there had never missed a Halloween. As the night deepened, small details began to pile together like bones. A scream rang out in the distance, high-pitched, sharp, but quickly followed by laughter so no one could tell if it was fear or joy. A man walking his dog noticed the animal pulling toward the woods, growling at something unseen. The man swore he heard whispering voices coming from the trees, though he could not make out the words. Children swore they saw shadows moving where no one stood, shapes slipping between houses too tall to belong to any costume. Still, the town pressed forward. That was the nature of the night, fear hidden beneath the excuse of fun. A child running in panic could be mistaken for someone playing a prank. A strange sound in the dark could be dismissed as part of the celebration, and so the warnings went ignored. It was around this time that a group of friends gathered near the town square to play hide-and-seek. They scattered into the shadows, weaving between parked cars and clusters of jack-o'-lanterns, laughing as they ran. But when the seeker finished counting, one of the players was already gone. At first they thought she was clever, hiding in some spot none of them had thought of. They searched for half an hour, their laughter fading into confusion. Finally, they found her mask lying on the ground in an alley. It was torn down the middle as if someone had ripped it from her face with both hands. No trace of her remained. They called her name until their voices cracked, but only the sound of wind answered back. When they told the adults, no one believed them. Children often wandered off on Halloween. Perhaps she had gone home. Perhaps she was playing a joke. That was what they said aloud. But behind their words, their eyes betrayed fear. Everyone knew the story sounded too familiar. Everyone remembered the family that vanished decades ago. And yet still they chose silence. As the hours passed, more oddities appeared. A woman handing out candy swore she saw a figure in a mask standing across the street, watching her house for nearly an hour without moving. When she finally shouted, the figure turned away, but she noticed something wrong. The mask was carved with no mouth, yet she could hear a breath escaping from it. Another man claimed he opened his door to find children waiting for candy, but when he dropped sweets into their bags, the candy passed through as if the bags were empty air. He shut the door without looking again. The police received several calls, though most were dismissed as holiday pranks. They logged missing items, vandalized decorations, and vague reports of strangers in strange costumes. None of it seemed serious. After all, how could anyone prove what they saw when masks and shadows ruled the streets? Halloween blurred the line between real and imagined, making every testimony questionable. But then came the turning point. Near midnight, several families reported hearing knocking at their doors, long after the trick-or-treaters should have gone home. The knocks were deliberate, 3 slow raps that echoed into the walls. When they opened their doors, no one stood outside. Only empty buckets of candy sat on the steps, already filled to the brim with sweets that no one in the house recognized. Some claimed the wrappers were old, brittle, belonging to brands that had not existed for decades. Others swore the buckets held more than candy, objects that should not have been there. A photograph of a family none of them knew. A rusted key, a bone too small to belong to an animal. By then, fear spread quietly through the town. Parents ushered children inside, curtains snapped shut, and the once lively streets grew still. The laughter had died away, leaving only the sound of wind against gutters and the faint creak of swings left swaying in backyards. Some believed the night was over, that whatever had passed would leave them alone now. But they were wrong. A final event sealed the night in memory. Near the edge of the square, the remaining jack-o'-lanterns began to flicker in unison. Dozens of them, their carved faces glowing brighter, then dimmer, until finally every single one went dark at the same instant. The sudden blackness covered the street like a veil, and in that moment several people swore they saw figures standing among them. Not walking, not moving, but simply appearing where the pumpkins had burned only seconds before. Tall, pale, silent, watching. When the lights returned, the figures were gone, but the memory remained. Some screamed, some refused to speak of it at all, and some swore it never happened. But those who lived through it carried the same question deep inside them, one they never answered. Were those shapes born of shadows and fear, or had they always been there, waiting for the lights to go out? The morning after should have brought relief, but instead it left the town shrouded in a silence thicker than the night before. People woke with the uneasy feeling that something had shifted, though many could not explain why. The children who had laughed and screamed hours earlier sat pale at breakfast tables, their voices hushed, their eyes darting toward doors and windows. Parents searched for explanations but found none, and when the stories began to circulate piece by piece, the unease sharpened into fear. The first account came from the children who lost their friend during hide-and-seek. They swore they had searched every alley, every yard, every patch of shadow, only to find her mask torn open and left on the ground like discarded skin. They described the mask not as something dropped in play, but as if it had been broken apart in violence. One boy insisted that when he touched it, it felt wet, though there was no sign of rain that night. The officers who collected the mask reported nothing unusual, yet none of them could say where it was stored afterward. It never appeared in evidence logs. It simply vanished as if the object itself had been taken back. Then came the reports of the candy buckets. Families who received them were hesitant to speak at first, embarrassed to describe what they found inside, but whispers spread quickly. One house discovered candy wrapped in brands that had disappeared decades ago. Logos unfamiliar to younger eyes but instantly recognized by the elderly. Another household swore the wrappers crumbled to dust the moment they touched them, leaving only strange, bitter-smelling residue behind. A woman across town described finding her bucket filled not with sweets, but with trinkets she did not own, a brass key, a cracked locket with a stranger's portrait, and what she believed was a fragment of bone. She left the items outside the next day hoping they would disappear, and by evening they were gone. Footprints were reported too. Not the playful scuffs of children's shoes, but deep impressions pressed into soft earth and wet leaves. They were too long, too narrow, and they stretched in unnatural patterns, circles that led nowhere, trails that began without origin. Some residents said they found footprints leading up to their doors, only to stop abruptly on the porch as if the visitor had vanished mid-step. A local farmer claimed to find prints along the edges of his field, parallel to the rows of corn, as though something had walked the length of his property in perfect silence. Witness testimony painted an even stranger picture. One man described seeing a figure in a mask without eyes, yet he swore he could feel its gaze piercing through him. Another insisted that when he heard knocking at his door, he looked through the window and saw children waiting, their costumes frozen, their faces blank. Yet when he opened the door, the porch was empty, and the knocking began again from inside the house. He moved away the following month, leaving behind everything he owned. Not everyone agreed on what happened. Some residents suggested hysteria had spread through the town. They argued that the night was filled with tricks, illusions, and fear, and that people's minds created monsters out of shadows. But those who lived the experiences disagreed. They insisted the fear was not born of imagination. It was carved into them by something real, something that had touched their streets, their homes, their lives. Experts who later heard fragments of the story offered conflicting theories. A psychologist suggested the children had been swept into mass panic, their imaginations amplified by the dark and by the power of suggestion. Another speculated that the town carried an inherited trauma, old legends shaping modern minds into seeing patterns where none existed. But there were others, historians, folklorists, who leaned closer to the old explanations. They spoke of rituals once performed on this land, sacrifices made to appease forces that lived just beyond human sight. They reminded the town that masks and lanterns were never meant for fun. They were shields, disguises, desperate attempts to keep something else away. Artifacts surfaced in the days after. A lantern found smashed in the square, its glass etched with symbols no one admitted carving. A row of pumpkins discovered near the riverbank, their faces uncarved but their surfaces split open as if burned from within. A torn piece of cloth pinned to a tree with something sharp, though no one could say what it had come from. Each item was collected, photographed, and logged, but later none of it could be found. The evidence room stood empty, its shelves bare, the contradictions multiplied. Some swore the missing girl never existed at all, claiming her name was not on school records or local registers. Others remembered her vividly, could describe her costume, her laugh, the way she carried her bag of candy. A few even claimed to remember 2 children missing, not one, though no one could agree on who the second might have been. Memory fractured in strange, deliberate ways, as if the event itself resisted being preserved. For every piece of evidence, there was a gap, a silence, a detail erased. And that was perhaps the most terrifying discovery of all. It was not that the town lacked proof of what had happened. It was that the proof refused to remain. Objects vanished, memories warped, and voices fell silent. The more they tried to hold on to the night, the more it slipped away, leaving only fragments sharp enough to wound but never whole enough to explain. By the end of that week, the town realized the truth they had long avoided. They were not the keepers of the story. They were the victims of it. Something else, something patient and watchful, held the story in its grasp, and it allowed them only enough detail to remember their fear. Nothing more. Fear does not vanish when the sun rises. It lingers in the corners of rooms, in the pauses between words, in the way eyes flicker toward shadows as if expecting them to move. In the weeks after that Halloween, the town was not the same. Its people did not speak of the night, but silence itself became the loudest voice. Streets that had once welcomed laughter now carried only whispers, and every window seemed to hold a watcher pressed against the glass. Children who once begged to wear costumes refused to put them on. Parents who had dressed their porches with lanterns and cobwebs tore the decorations down and stuffed them into boxes, shoving them into attics they never opened again. On the surface, the town went on living, but beneath it there was a fracture, raw and unhealed. The event was not forgotten. It was avoided, like a wound that could not be touched without reopening. The missing girl haunted the streets even more than if she had remained. Her absence weighed on the children who once played beside her, on the parents who remembered her laughter. But something stranger happened. Her memory began to dissolve. Faces blurred in the minds of those who swore they had known her. Names slipped away mid-sentence. A mother claimed her son had drawn pictures of her the week before, yet when she searched his sketchbook, the pages were blank. People carried the sensation of loss without the clarity of who or what they had lost. It was grief stripped of recognition, and it hollowed them out in ways no burial could. Families began to unravel. Arguments broke out in kitchens at night, voices cracking with exhaustion. A father accused his wife of lying about what she saw at the door. A brother claimed his sister had invented her story of the silent figure standing in the street. Neighbors whispered suspicions of one another, muttering that someone among them must be responsible, that no horror could exist without human hands behind it. Distrust spread like rot. Doors that had once opened freely to friends now stayed bolted shut. Some reacted differently. A few clung to religion, filling the church pews in desperation only to watch the candles sputter and die before the prayers could be finished. Others left food outside their homes, small offerings like those made in older times, bowls of milk, slices of bread, even photographs of loved ones, as if bargaining with something unseen to take anything but them. Most, however, withdrew into themselves. Fear hardened them. They avoided the streets after dark. They spoke in hushed tones, and they taught their children new lessons. Never open the door at night. Never follow a voice you do not recognize. Never trust a mask. The children, too, carried the scars. Some woke screaming in the middle of the night, swearing they saw faces staring at them through their windows. Others stopped sleeping entirely, sitting awake until dawn, their eyes red and unfocused. Teachers noticed drawings scrawled in the margins of notebooks, figures too tall, faces with hollow eyes, houses with doors blackened out. One boy was found digging a hole in his backyard, whispering that he needed to bury something before it could find him. When asked what he meant, he only stared silently and would not speak again. Paranoia spread in small, quiet ways. People claimed to hear footsteps in their attics, even though no one lived above them. A woman swore she saw her husband sitting at the edge of the bed one night, only to find him asleep beside her when she reached out. Others heard their names whispered in voices that belonged to no one they knew. It was as though the night had left an imprint on the town, a stain invisible to outsiders but felt by everyone within. Psychologists who later studied the survivors described their condition as collective trauma, a phenomenon where memory itself becomes unreliable under the weight of fear. But the townspeople did not speak of trauma. They spoke of a curse. They spoke of something unfinished, something that had entered their lives and refused to leave. They were not simply remembering the night, they were reliving it, Over and over, in every flicker of shadow, in every knock that sounded too deliberate, in every silence that seemed too long. The paranoia grew so deep that some families moved away, abandoning homes that had belonged to them for generations. They left without farewell, without explanation, packing their belongings in the dark of morning and driving until the town shrank in their rearview mirrors. Those who stayed watched their neighbors vanish, but they did not follow. They were rooted to the soil, bound to it by fear as much as by familiarity. They believed leaving would not save them, that what had touched their town could follow. Others began to break in quieter, sadder ways. A shopkeeper who once greeted every customer with warmth now refused to look anyone in the eye. A woman who had sung in the church choir stopped speaking altogether. A group of children no longer played in the schoolyard but sat in silence, huddled together, staring at things no one else could see. The town had become less a community and more a collection of haunted individuals, each carrying their own fragment of the night. The strangest change, however, was the way the town itself seemed to breathe with the fear. The streets grew quieter, not only from people staying inside but from sound itself fading. Birds did not land on rooftops. Stray dogs avoided the alleys. The air carried an unnatural stillness, as though the earth beneath the houses was listening. Halloween had been a single night, but its shadow stretched across every day that followed, refusing to fade. In the end, the greatest horror was not the figures, the footprints, or the vanishings. It was the way the night hollowed the people out, left them uncertain of what was real and what was imagined, forced them to live in a world where memory could not be trusted. Fear had not ended when the sun rose. It had taken root inside them, and it grew in silence season after season, waiting for the next October to return. The town could not keep its silence forever. Whispers leaked into neighboring communities, carried by relatives who refused to visit again, by children who drew too many strange pictures in school, by shopkeepers who muttered about disappearances when they thought no one was listening. Eventually, attention arrived. Police patrols increased. Journalists appeared on porches with notebooks in hand, and investigators knocked on doors that had stayed bolted since that Halloween night. The first investigations focused on the obvious. Missing persons reports were filed, though none matched the descriptions of the children or families people claimed to remember. Birth certificates, school records, and medical files turned up blank spaces where names should have been. The girl said to have vanished during hide-and-seek left no official trace of her existence. No teacher listed her on their rolls, no photograph bore her face. Yet when officials asked children about her, many broke down crying, swearing they had played beside her for years. Memory fought against paper, and paper always won. Physical evidence did not fare better. The mask said to have been ripped in half was gone from the evidence room. The buckets filled with old candy and trinkets had disappeared from police storage. Even the footprints photographed in backyards were later found missing from the files, the negatives unaccounted for. Investigators accused one another of incompetence, but no one could explain how entire cases of evidence could vanish without a trace. Reporters filled the gaps with speculation. Some wrote of secret cults, of rituals performed in the shadows of cornfields, of sacrifices disguised as games. They pointed to the offerings left on porches, the old traditions quietly preserved by families, and suggested the town itself was complicit. Others dismissed it all as hysteria, a mass delusion fueled by isolation and folklore. They argued that people saw what they expected to see on Halloween night, and fear magnified the illusions. The articles drew attention, but they also painted the town as unstable, a place where imagination had devoured reason. The townspeople, humiliated, pushed outsiders away, but privately many wondered if the articles were right. Experts were brought in, psychologists, historians, even anthropologists curious about the blend of folklore and trauma. The psychologists claimed the town suffered from shared delusion, a psychological echo chamber where fear spread like contagion. The missing girl, they said, was an invented figure, a phantom memory born from group hysteria. The buckets of strange candy, the masks, the footprints, every detail was explained away as tricks of perception under stress. Trauma, they said, could make entire groups remember events that never occurred. The historians disagreed. They pointed to earlier records, to stories of disappearances on the same night decades earlier, to tales of families vanishing without explanation. They argued that the pattern stretched back centuries long before the town was built. The soil itself had a reputation. They spoke of the land being cursed, of rituals designed to keep whatever lived beneath it satisfied. They reminded people that Halloween was never meant for joy. It was a night for bargaining. The anthropologists offered another perspective. They suggested that masks and lanterns were not just cultural symbols, but spiritual barriers, tools meant to confuse or repel forces that did not belong in the human world. If the rituals had weakened, if people had stopped believing, perhaps that was enough to open a door that had stayed closed too long. Conflicting theories left the town with no peace. For every voice calling it hysteria, another whispered it was something far older. For every explanation of human error, there was evidence that could not be dismissed. Families argued not only among themselves but with outsiders. Those who wanted answers found only contradictions. Those who wanted silence found it impossible to maintain. And then there were the darker possibilities. A few investigators entertained the idea of ritualistic crime. They speculated that a secret group within the town staged the disappearances, planting false memories, destroying evidence, manipulating the community through fear. But even this theory collapsed under its own weight. No proof of such a group could be found, and no motive explained the erasure of memories, the vanishing of records, the artifacts that dissolved as soon as they were collected. The most unsettling theory came not from experts but from the townspeople themselves. A handful of older residents spoke of figures that returned every few decades, slipping into town under the cover of masks, blending into the crowds, and taking what they wished before fading back into the dark. These residents insisted the town was not cursed but chosen to feed something that did not care for belief, did not require worship but demanded acknowledgement through fear. Whether human, spirit, or something unnamed, no one could say. The official investigation closed with nothing resolved. No one was arrested, no missing persons were confirmed, no evidence remained. The files were sealed, left incomplete. Reporters moved on, chasing newer tragedies. Experts published papers that dismissed the case as folklore. But within the town, the silence deepened. People knew what the reports could not say. They had seen things that should not exist, heard voices that should not speak, felt eyes on them long after the streets were empty. And so the theories lingered, floating between denial and belief. Was it hysteria? A trick of the mind born from fear? Was it crime, human cruelty wearing the mask of something supernatural? Or was it truly what the old stories claimed? Something beyond human understanding? Something that used Halloween not as a holiday, but as a hunting ground? No answer satisfied. No theory closed the wound. And perhaps that was the greatest cruelty of all, that the town was left to live in the space between explanations, caught forever in the possibility that every theory might be true. The story did not end when the investigations closed their files. It never ends in places like this. Time passed, but the weight of that night never lifted. The town continued to live in its silence, watching the calendar with unease as every October crept closer. Each year, as the air sharpened and the leaves fell, the old fear returned. Doors were locked earlier, curtains drawn tighter, and lanterns glowed not with joy but with a desperate edge, as if the small flames were barriers holding back something that waited beyond. Children grew into adults, but they carried the same scars as when they were small. They passed the warnings forward, though their words changed over time. Do not answer the door after midnight. Do not trust every costume. Do not follow the sound of your name in the dark. The children who heard these rules often laughed, believing them to be nothing more than superstition. But by the time they grew older, the laughter had died, and they too lowered their voices when Halloween approached. The silence of the town became its identity. Outsiders spoke of it as a place that seemed frozen, a community that never welcomed visitors for long. Houses stood empty, left behind by those who could not bear the weight of memory, but new families rarely moved in. It was as if the town itself repelled strangers, holding onto its grief like a shield. On maps it was barely a dot, but for those who lived within its borders it felt like the center of something vast and dark. Every few years, something small happened to remind them. A scream carried too far across the fields, a mask left lying in the road, its paint peeling though no one admitted to owning it. Buckets of candy appearing on porches with wrappers from decades long past. Shadows flickering in alleys long after the lanterns went dark. Each event was quiet, subtle, easily dismissed, but they left behind the same hollow chill. The people knew what it meant. It meant that whatever had come before was not finished. It meant the silence was not safety. It was waiting. Theories continued to circulate, whispered behind closed doors. Some believed the events had been a single nightmare, never to return. Others insisted it was a cycle, a rhythm written into the soil. Every generation would face it, and every generation would fail to stop it. A few believed the town itself was alive, feeding on its people, trading lives for survival, and others, the ones who sat alone in dark rooms and refused to speak of what they had seen, believed something else entirely. They believed the masks had never hidden the monsters. They had only hidden the truth, that the monsters were always there, living quietly among them, waiting for the one night when they no longer needed to hide. Years later, some of the children who once survived the night tried to leave. They moved to distant cities, built lives far away, told themselves the past could not follow. Yet each one carried the same confession, whispered only in sleepless hours. No matter how far they went, they still dreamed of that Halloween. They still woke to knocking on doors that were not there. They still felt eyes in the corners of crowded streets. The fear followed them, not as a memory, but as a presence. It lived inside them, patient, quiet, eternal. The town itself became something of a ghost. Journalists stopped visiting. Investigators forgot the files, outsiders lost interest. The story faded from newspapers, vanished from records, and dissolved from memory. But the people knew forgetting did not matter. Some things do not need to be remembered to be real. Some things live beneath memory, beneath time, beneath the fragile belief that what cannot be proven cannot exist. As October returns again and again, the air always grows heavier. The pumpkins burn lower, the streets fall quieter, and the same question lingers in every heart, though no one speaks it aloud. Was that night an ending, or was it only the beginning? Was it an accident of fear, or was it a reminder of something that would return until the masks no longer mattered at all? No one knows, and perhaps no one ever will. But each year, as the clock strikes midnight and the last of the laughter fades, the knocking begins again, slow, deliberate, patient. 3 times against the door. What waits on the other side does not care whether you believe. It only cares that you answer. So ask yourself, before you blow out the lantern and turn away from the window, before you dismiss the sound in the hallway as a trick of your mind, before you open the door to check who is waiting, will you like what you see when the mask comes off?